Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and my guest today is Dr. Peter Bongiorno, who is a naturopathic doctor and licensed acupuncturist. And I had the good fortune of actually practicing with Dr. Bongiorno for, I think, almost a decade in Manhattan,
Mm.
back when I had a practice in Connecticut. So we've known each other for many, many years and have been good friends. And one of the cool things is that Dr. Peter is an expert in mental health. He's actually written several books, but today I really want to hone in on anxiety. So, Dr. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Ingels. Thanks for having me.
We were talking just before we jumped on our recording here that, I've seen this in my practice, especially since the pandemic, that it seems like everybody coming in, whether it's a child or an adult, is having almost to the point of debilitating anxiety. And
Mm.
whether it's social anxiety or anxiety about health issues or anxiety about finances, and so many of those people are getting, treated, I mean, by psychiatrists with medication, which usually come with a very long list of side effects. I mean, is this something, Peter, you're seeing in your practice as well, or is it just me?
Gosh, yes, no question. And certainly after the pandemic, I think the pandemic was such a stressful moment for people, emotionally, physically, financially. Um, the name of your podcast includes the word resilience in it, right? And that's such a powerful word to use there. I'm so glad you're using that. And I think that's what happens with anxiety is we have these built-in abilities to handle issues and things that come up with our life. But after a while, for different reasons, and I'm sure we're going to talk about those underlying factors, the resiliency just kind of goes down, and our body says, okay, I can't take anymore. And for many of us, it manifests as anxiety.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to jump right in, on the causes. And of course, I know that's like a 3-day seminar, but, what are some of the things you're seeing that seem to be the driving factors, particularly for people who really, don't have a history of anxiety, that all of a sudden now they're starting to feel these different symptoms? What are maybe the top 4 or 5 things that you see in your practice as being big drivers of anxiety?
Sure. Well, years ago, I had really terrific anxiety. I'm going to be 57, and in my early 20s, I had pretty significant anxiety and some panic attacks and things. And I remember, even though I knew nothing about medicine, what I learned at the time, it was before I went to naturopathic school, is I learned that it was multifactorial, that I was personally worried about my future, right? So I had these ideas about what my future was supposed to be and what I was supposed to be doing, and I wasn't living up to it. And that
Right.
was creating a lot of stress for me. I was playing in a band. I was not getting enough sleep. I wasn't exercising. My food intake was very poor, and I'm sure my blood sugar must have been all over the place. For me personally, when I experienced that, I think those were main factors. Now, of course, everybody's different, but I do see for many of my patients, poor sleep is a big issue. When blood sugar is dysregulated, either too high or too low or bouncing up and down, that's going to be a contributor. I see many people with nutrient deficiencies, when there isn't enough iron in the body, when there aren't enough B vitamins in the body, enough vitamin D, not taking in enough protein. Occasionally, excess nutrients can do that too, right? So those are, I think, top issues from a diet and lifestyle standpoint.
Yeah, I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I was thinking about this because, as you kind of mentioned, some of these factors like not sleeping well, and maybe
Mhm.
I see a lot of people too that their dietary pattern is very irregular in terms of like when they eat, the timing is off and off, or maybe they're
Mhm.
eating on the run. How much of this might even be tied into hormones? And I'm thinking specifically about
Yeah.
cortisol. Is
Yeah.
it one of these things that as your cortisol gets more dysregulated, that your disposition towards anxiety increases?
Sure. So when I work with a patient and we're working with anxiety, I almost always run urinary cortisol tests. And what those tests do is they look at your cortisol. So cortisol is one of your main stress responder hormones that get released from your adrenal glands when you're running from a bear or feeling like you're running from a bear, meaning your daily stress life. And it's good to check that cortisol because what I've learned is cortisol oftentimes is high, and there are natural ways to work on cortisol. And sometimes cortisol can get very low. And some people can have the same symptoms, whether it's high or low or just very dysregulated. And so you're right. Looking at cortisol can be very, very valuable. And cortisol is also one of the molecules in the body that regulate your blood sugar and how your blood sugar gets released too. So it's very part and parcel of what's going on with blood sugar regulation as well.
Yeah. Do you see any difference between, children and adults dealing with anxiety in terms of, again, the kind of things that are underlying that? Does it seem to be separate issues with kids, or is it really just kind of a gradation of the same kind of issues that
Yeah.
maybe start early in childhood and just kind of worsen as people get older?
Sure. Well, the first thing when I think about children and anxiety, and I'm talking about like under 11 or 12 years old, is there's a different clinical picture. Oftentimes, you'll see anxiety manifest more physically in the body, oftentimes with digestive issues. A lot of times when I'll see a child come in and they have what looks like an irritable bowel syndrome, they have diarrhea, they have constipation, their tummy is always hurting. I start to ask questions to the parents about stress and life in the home and the environment there because a lot of times kids won't be anxious the way us adults are, where we just kind of feel anxious or we have panic attacks or something, but it'll manifest more physically. They might get headaches, things like that, and then they don't want to go places because they don't feel good. Sometimes some kids are more anxious the way we think adults are anxious. Sometimes it'll manifest even as sleeping issues. Sometimes you'll see it as like they're not doing well in school, they're not socializing. So the first thing is always to look for those kinds of signs and symptoms for anxiety and depression in children, because it could be different. And then as far as the causes, again, poor sleep is a big one for kids. When they're not eating regular meals, that can be an issue. If they're very constipated and they're not moving their bowels, a lot of kids today, they're picky eaters, and sometimes if we can't get them to eat enough fiber and drink enough water, their bowels will stop. And one thing that we know about the brain is that it's very connected to the gut. So
Right.
if the gut isn't moving well, it's hard for the brain to have a balanced level of neurotransmitters. So I think that can be true for kids as well.
This might be controversial, but what are your thoughts in terms of like electronics? It seems that
Yeah,
the almost addiction to iPhone, iPad, social media. It seems to me that that's also a big driver, maybe
sure.
in younger people than adults, for anxiety. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that controversial. I think the research is pretty clear that screen time, the amount of screen time is very much associated with anxiety and depression in children and adolescents. There's no question about it. There is some data that shows, like, let's say during the pandemic, when children are isolated, especially boys, tended to do better emotionally when they were using screens and things to stay connected and play games with their friends. So I think there is a positive aspect to social media and that kind of, video game playing and things, but overall, there's no question that children, adolescents are on the screens way too much, and that it's changing their brain. It's changing their neurotransmitters. There's a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter of reward. And dopamine goes up very quickly when you're looking at screens and you make you feel good and you keep going from one thing to the other. And then when the parent says, "Hey, that's enough, take it away," the child goes ballistic. Well, why? Because their dopamine just dropped out. They're going through withdrawal and they want it back. It's
No.
a drug, right? It's a drug. We use social media. We use drugs, right? We that even the words we use for them reference the idea that it is very drug-like. So there's no question that social media and electronics and screens have their place and can be very helpful. And we're not going to live without them anymore, right? But
Yeah.
but we have to keep them in balance. Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about treatment of anxiety. And of course, being a naturopathic doctor and a licensed acupuncturist, I know you've got a very unique natural perspective on this. But before we kind of talk about that, I want people to understand, when is the time where you're like, hey, maybe medication really is
Yeah.
warranted here? What are the kind of those red flags for you that would say, you really need to get in the hands of perhaps a psychiatrist to help manage this until we get an opportunity to look at some of
Mhm.
these underlying issues?
Sure. That's a great question and an important safety question. First of all, for those who are listening who are on medications, I'm sure as we go on, we're going to talk about a lot of wonderful natural remedies and ways to help. I never recommend you just get off your medications. It's always important to stay on your medications. And if you have a concern with your medication, especially side effects, you have to talk to your prescribing doctor. Having said that, when medications are used judiciously, they can be life-saving, especially in cases of depression, severe depression, when somebody might consider hurting themselves or hurting somebody else. So when I think about judicious use of medication, if a patient isn't able to help themselves, like they can't even get out of bed, they're so riddled with anxiety, they can't function, a single mom who's not feeding her children or taking care of herself. Even though I love natural medicine, there's a lot of things to do in natural medicine. There's tests to get, supplements to take, foods to change, bedtime ritual, all these things. But when you feel that poorly, sometimes you can't do any of those things. And that's
Right.
sometimes when a medication, when used properly, can help people feel better, lower the symptoms to get to the place where they can start doing the things they need to do. And my concern with modern psychiatry is unfortunately, people get placed on medications but there's no plan to get them off, right? They
Right.
stay, oh, you feel better? Great. Keep taking it. We'll check in a month. And there's no plan. There's no plan to check the underlying issues. And then there's no plan to eventually help them off. And honestly, that's why I have a job. Most of the patients I see in New York, in Manhattan and in this area in the Northeast, most of them are already on medications, whether it's benzodiazepines or antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications. And it's my job to not say, oh, they're bad, don't take them. It's my job to say, okay, if you're doing well enough with them, let's figure out the underlying cause. Let's start working on those things, getting things back into your life that you need, whether it's, living the life you want to live, getting to sleep on time, moving your body. And then once we're there, then we could start talking about that process of weaning off, and doing it successfully. Because now we've set you up for success by working on the underlying issues. And that's what's exciting to me. That's what makes, for me, my job such a happy one because I get to help people figure that out, those underlying issues out, which is so different for everybody.
Well, exactly. I know everyone's experience is going to be different, how anxiety affects you. Again, some people might be on medication, some people this might be brand new and there's no medication. But walk us through, your process of, what are some of the foundational things you think, this is kind of where everybody probably needs to start. And then, I'd love to talk about maybe some other
Mhm.
specific supplements, herbs, nutrients you
So,
use that you find are helpful for people.
yeah, well, the very basics for anxiety, especially, as I mentioned before, the basics are sleep. People have to assure they're sleeping enough, moving their body. I know for me, when I had a lot of anxiety, exercise was absolutely key. Um, Occasionally, people exercise too much and they have to exercise less, especially more obsessive compulsive kind of things. So I always ask about that to make sure it's not too much. Drinking enough water is really critical. I think you and I had the same teacher back in school, right? Dr. Bill Mitchell. And
Yeah.
he said when people had a condition and you knew they weren't drinking enough water, he said, give them something, an herb or something, tell them they have to take it 3 times a day in a big glass of water. He goes, and you'll watch people get better. And of course it wasn't the pill or the herb, it was the water. So many people are so
Exactly.
dehydrated. We need good hydration to get tryptophan to be made into serotonin in the brain. So there's research that shows you when you don't drink enough water, you're going to be more likely to be anxious and depressed as well. So that's really critical. Foods. There's such robust research now about how healthy eating can really help you prevent and treat anxiety. And conversely, there's so much information now on ultra processed food. If you look up Google ultra processed food and anxiety, you're going to see a whole lot of literature about how, especially in adolescence, how important it is to eat healthier. And of course, that's the population that's the toughest, right? To get that food in. But that will set up a much better brain for later life. And it's not that we can't ever eat those fun foods, but to really keep them as more of a treat and not the thing we eat as a regular meal to sustain ourselves. And then, doing the right testing, I think is very important. As you mentioned, looking at cortisol, I think that's very, very helpful. Looking at iron levels, the thyroid, you mentioned hormones before, looking at the balances of the hormones, I find especially in perimenopausal women, looking at all those hormonal balances, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Men, those hormones are just as important. In fact, estrogen helps the male brain make serotonin and serotonin receptors. So we got to be checking these things in men as well as women. And then looking at inflammation in the body, looking at all the nutrients, vitamin D, B12, B6, zinc, copper. I can go on and on. There's so many, things, and that's the interesting part for me to figure out what tests are going to be most useful. Some patients, I do stool testing because, if I suspect that their digestive system is out of alignment, that's going to cause trouble with their nervous system and contribute to anxiety. High histamine levels, like if we have these allergic kind of responses either to the environment or to foods, and we make histamines in our body, that can change the brain and make it more anxious. Then there's toxicities, things like mold toxicity, other environmental toxicities. So I like to make sure I'm thinking about those, especially if a patient seems like, they fit that clinical picture or they clearly have exposures. So a lot of things to think about.
Yeah, I think there's been some really interesting research on mast cell activation as a trigger for basically neural inflammation, which can
Right.
translate into anxiety, depression. And I think, the newer
100%.
evidence, particularly in depression, seems to suggest that serotonin really never was the magic bullet in
Right.
dealing with
Right.
depression, and that perhaps it's elevated histamine or some element of mast cell activation in the brain that's really kind of
Yep.
triggering this neurological change. And of course, we don't do brain biopsies on living people, so we don't really
Yeah.
have a direct way of measuring that in the brain. And often we're looking at urine test or sometimes even saliva test to try and get a relative
Right.
proportion of your neurochemistry. But
Hmm.
it's not exactly the same. And
Yeah.
I've seen it in my patient practice that often if we do different things, like I said, to curtail mast cell activation,
Hmm.
anxiety and depression and mood and a lot of things get better for all the things you just listed, from food to environmental triggers to toxins to infection. I mean, anything that can be a mast cell activator can lead to some element of neuropsychiatric issues.
Absolutely. In fact, and as you said, there's no brain biopsies because, of course, that's completely unethical to do a brain biopsy in someone with mental health issues. But there are postmortem studies, meaning studies about people after they passed and they looked at their brain. And many people with anxiety and depression do show a lot of neuroinflammation. So it's very consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in terms of, no, maybe nutrients, herbs, are there
Mhm.
specific things that you find are useful?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the person. So not everything works for everyone. I would say some of my favorites, if I would probably start with CBD. CBD, which became legal in the United States through the Farm Bill in 2018, is very, very valuable. It works on a lot of mechanisms. It works on what's called the endocannabinoid system, which is the system that is parallel to the nervous system. It's a very important part of how our body stays kind of calm and balanced. And a lot of times when we're stressed out, when we have a lot going on in our lives, when our nutrient levels are low, inflammation in the body, our endocannabinoid system will kind of shut down to allow us to stay more nervous and anxious. And we can take these phytocannabinoids, meaning these cannabinoids that come from plants. Now, I'm not talking about THC and marijuana, which makes us more, a little loopy, has a psychoactive effect. I'm talking about CBD, which is very calming and doesn't have a psychoactive effect. And there's a few other cannabinoids from the hemp plant as well and marijuana that can be very calming, but not create that high, that you don't want to walk around with a high every day, but it's nice to stay calm. So I find CBD can be very valuable. Especially in younger people, I use a fair amount of lithium orotate, also known as nutritional lithium. And that's not the lithium drug that
Right.
that a psychiatrist would give for bipolar disorder. It's a much, much lower dose lithium without some of the other drug components that you see in the pharmaceutical. And it can be very calming for the brain. It's basically a mineral similar to similar to magnesium, and can be very helpful to calm some of the fear centers of the brain. Theanine is an amino acid that comes from green tea, and it doesn't have caffeine like green tea, but it's very calming. And there are studies that show it helps get our brain in what's called alpha state, which is that kind of calm, meditative state that we get into before we fall asleep. I had a patient earlier today who was, complaining that she had issues with falling asleep. So one of the things I recommended was she starts some theanine at night. And the theanine, I'm expecting, is going to help her feel calmer so that she can fall into the first stage of sleep properly, which is very important to get into a deep sleep so that this way it's restorative so we can wake up in the morning and feel less anxious. Magnesium is brilliant. I'd say that's such a safe thing to take. It's hard to, when you overdose on magnesium, you basically get diarrhea. So it's hard to get into trouble with magnesium unless you have some kidney issues, and you got to be a little more careful with it. But otherwise, it's also very calming, very gentle. Um,
Along the lines of magnesium, are there, because there's different chelates of magnesium, are there specific forms of magnesium you think work better than others for specifically anxiety?
yeah. So the two forms of magnesium I probably use the most is magnesium glycinate. Glycine in the body is also very calming. So there's a form of magnesium that is paired with glycine, and it can be very calming. And the other one, which is probably a little less known, is magnesium threonate. Magnesium threonate is very, very calming. It tends to cross the blood-brain barrier easier than other forms of magnesium, so it's a little easier to get to the central nervous system and create more of a calming effect. So those are probably the two from an anxiety standpoint I would consider first. Yeah,
Yeah, I want to just mention that a lot of things you've already talked about. What's really nice about a lot of these natural products is that in their effort to calm the nervous system down, they don't usually make you tired. And
right.
often a lot of the medications that are used to treat anxiety have the side effect of causing fatigue. And
That's
again, if
right.
you need to function during the day, you need to take care of your kids, you need to work, you need to do whatever. That's really difficult now if you're kind of struggling with just staying awake and alert
Right.
and all these things, we call them nervines in naturopathic medicine. It means it calms your nervous system down, but it doesn't make you sedated or tired. So you can very safely and easily take something like theanine or magnesium,
Yeah.
feel chill, but not feel like you need to take a nap.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true. I will add to that though. Some people, if underlying they are very tired and it's their norepinephrine, their stress hormones that are kind of keeping them up, then sometimes when they finally relax, they will feel tired. Like I notice people when I give them acupuncture, it really relaxes them in the moment. And then they're like, oh my God, I feel so tired. And it's really because underneath they were already very fatigued. They just didn't know it because they were running on, stress hormones for so long. So,
Well, and acupuncture, I mean, again, you're a licensed acupuncturist. I am not, but my experience is that acupuncture by itself is a wonderful way of dealing with anxiety. And I've
yeah,
had some patients tell me that it's been more effective than any pill, medication, or otherwise that they've taken to help just calm their nervous system down. Often they get off the table and they just feel zen.
yeah, 100%. I work here in the middle of Manhattan, right in Midtown Manhattan, and And it's fun because I'm in a room giving acupuncture and in the middle of Manhattan, in the middle of all the hype and crazy, and then they'll walk outside and they'll be like, "It feels so much calmer than when I came in." So that's nice. So it does really work. Although I always recommend still working on all the naturopathic fundamentals, sleep,
Yeah.
exercise, getting the right labs, because acupuncture does work, but you have to keep coming. I tell people it's good for my business. You keep coming in for acupuncture, but what we want to do is really fix the underlying issues so you don't have to keep coming in. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll mention too, I think there's some other really wonderful herbs for anxiety that I've used. I mean, there's things like lemon balm and
Yeah, Melissa.
chamomile. I'm a big fan of California poppy. That's become one of my new favorite. It just seems to work
Yeah.
well for a lot of people. Again, in terms of calming people down, getting
Hmm.
rid of some of that stress and anxiety. It helps people with their sleep. I've used kava
Yeah.
kava with some patients. So we've got
Hmm.
a lot in the plant world that
Oh
has
gosh,
again,
yeah.
this nervine effect. And again, sometimes you just have to try and see what works best for you. But if you've tried a plant for, 2 or 3 weeks, you don't really feel like it's doing it, even if you've upped the dose, it might be worth just, trying something different. And again, I think, we would both agree that if this is something that you're really unfamiliar with, get in the hands of a naturopathic doctor or functional medicine
Mhm.
practitioner who really understands plants that can give you better advice on which plants, what
Absolutely.
source, what dose, because obviously everyone's very different and
Yep.
the needs are different.
Yeah, and I'd love to add to that herbalist, passion flower,
Yeah.
passiflora. I find that's very, very helpful for a lot of patients. I love using
I
that.
use a lot of passion flower for kids. They make a
Mm,
nice glycerin. There's several companies that make a passion flower glycerin, so it's got a nice sweet flavor. Kids
yeah.
will actually take it, and it works really well. And sometimes, again, you can even get away with using drop doses with some people, and it's just enough to take the edge off.
Yeah, yeah, it's great, and it's and I find the herbal medications especially valuable if I have a patient who comes in, who says, "Yeah, I tried the drugs and they're just so strong. I get side effects. Like, it helped, but I can't take the side effects. Whatever they may be." And they're the perfect candidate for the herbs because herbs are not as strong as drugs, but they do work. And they have so much less in terms of side effects that it's often the perfect match for a patient who is, I know you and I see many patients who are so sensitive.
Right.
And I think what we do is so wonderful for people who are so sensitive.
What about, someone that says they're already on medication and they want to try herbs, they want to try nutrients? Any concerns of potential interactions?
Well, there are some herbs and amino acids and things that will work on the same pathways. So I strongly recommend if you want to try those things, work with a naturopathic doctor, work with a functional medicine practitioner, someone who's really knowledgeable about drug herb interactions. Because, yeah, I mean, these things do make changes in the body. And typically, I mean, oftentimes I will use them together alongside medications, but I'm always thinking about what the mechanisms of the drugs are, what the mechanisms of the herbs or the supplements are. So this way we're not overdoing anything.
Yeah.
So that's my strong recommendation. Without medications, I think there's a little room to work, but medications are very strong. And sometimes when you push them over the edge, then that's what you can get into trouble.
Yeah, I will mention St. John's wort, which is primarily used for depression versus
Yeah.
anxiety, is one that I would really never recommend if you're on medication because we've got so much research that that herb almost interferes with
Yeah.
every psychiatric medication. They're generally not safe to take together. So that is
Right.
one plant I would probably
Yeah.
avoid if you're on meds.
And I do use St. John's wort with anxiety often as well. Certain features of anxiety can be really useful. But you're right, there is a lot of literature about it. There's literature about CBD in terms of with blood pressure medications and interactions with certain statin medications too, anticoagulants as well. Same with St. John's wort. But let's also remember, there's studies on St. John's wort, for example, with like Plavix in
Yeah,
people who take it as an anticoagulant. Now, people who were taking it for and for blood thinning effect, but they couldn't get the dose high enough because of side effects. When they took it with St. John's wort, it actually helped the drug work better and they got the benefit of the herb for their mental health. So, and that's why I say always work with a knowledgeable practitioner, because if you have someone who really knows what they're doing, the interactions could actually be, instead of side effects, they can actually be side benefits. So they work both ways.
That's great.
You know.
Before we close out today, any parting thoughts on, people dealing with anxiety that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to say that I know what it feels like to have that level of anxiety, and I've worked with so many patients over the last 23 years, and there's always something that can be done. Anxiety is purely your body saying something is out of balance. Whether it's stress, psychological, physical things that we talked about, probably a few things we didn't even discuss today because there's only so much time. But seek out a practitioner who won't take no for an answer until until they figure out what the underlying cause is, because there's always a way to help. There's always a way to make it better. And I know when you have anxiety, sometimes you feel like, oh my God, this is me. This is my body. It's never going to change. Yeah, maybe other people got better, but I'm not going to get better. Don't take that for an answer. Work with someone who's going to really keep working on it until you get to where you want to be, because you deserve to feel good.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I know you've written a book about this. You've got a book called Put Anxiety Behind You. And I know you've
Yes.
got a lot of these tips and
Thank you for
trips.
asking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know you've
so
got a
this
lot
is
of
the
So I know you got a lot of great tips and information in here. So we're going to drop a
Thank
link
you.
in the show notes for the book. Again,
Thank you.
if you or anyone you know has been struggling with anxiety, please pick up a copy. It's just got a lot of really great information on helping managing it. But like Dr. Peter said, it's good to have someone on your team that can help navigate this for you, because some things are very easy to do on your own, and other things it's good to have some professional support around that. And particularly if you are on medication or you're considering medication, you definitely want to be in the hands of someone who does a lot of this to make sure you're getting the right combination for you.
100%.
Great. Well, Peter,
Okay.
always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me today on the
Thank
podcast.
you. Thank you, Dr. Darin.